Hello ladies and gentlemen. Karen Sharp here, with Professor Randolph Hemmings. This is part 3 of a 4-part series on the origins of the US color line.
Thank you, Karen. This is session C7C, after the invention of the color line. To recap, the United States is unique in preserving a genetic enclave of mostly African ancestry. The enclave results from an intermarriage barrier imposed in 1691, which is still in place due to social pressure. Today we discuss the period when the US horror of Euro-Afro intermarriage spread throughout the colonies. For 3 generations Chesapeake colonists had intermarried freely. Then, in 1691, Virginia made the holy sacrament of matrimony a crime, if celebrated between an African and a European. The bizarre legislation struck like a thunderclap. Dozens of interracial families, including the descendants of Anthony Johnson, fled from Virginia to Maryland. Such innovative legislation had never happened before in world history. It would never happen independently again. But it happened this once, and once was enough. The following year Maryland also outlawed intermarriage, virtually copying the 1691 Virginia law. Dozens of interracial families, among them those who had fled from Virginia, now fled from Maryland to Pennsylvania. 4 years later, in 1696, Virginia's rulers made their anti-intermarriage law harsher. Apparently, the colonists were not taking the law seriously enough. The 1696 change added the offending minister as complicit in the crime of intermarriage. After this change, interracial married couples would be banished, as before, but now the minister who married them would be fined £10,000 of tobacco. Since this was far beyond the reach of even some landed gentry, it meant the ministers defrocking. The new law explicitly ordered ministers to preach against intermarriage. Those who refused to comply were also defrocked and replaced. How the landed gentry acquired the church authority to appoint and fire priests and bishops is explained elsewhere. Over the next few decades, penalties became increasingly cruel. According to one historian, a horror of intermarriage was planted in the minds of the colonists by the creation of a total system of domination that penetrated every corner of colonial life and made use of every colonial institution. Nothing was left to chance. The assemblies, the courts, the churches, and the press were thrown into the breach. A massive propaganda campaign confused and demoralized the public, and private vigilante groups supplemented the official campaign of hate and terror. No endogamous barrier is perfect, however, and America's new color line leaked. Despite the threat of law, the preaching of religious leaders, and the pressure of social peers, people of mixed heritage continued to be born. Conventional wisdom holds that such mixing was the result of European male slave owners raping, or at least economically coercing female slaves. In fact, although colonial interracial mating was somewhat asymmetrical, it was not all that one-sided. Many Americans today, white as well as black, carry mitochondrial DNA of matrilineal European descent and Y chromosomes of patrilineal African ancestry. Nevertheless, whether the continued production of biracial children was the result of African males joining with European females or vice versa, colonists of every intermediate gradation continued to be born during the 18th century. Multiracial colonists had no legal existence then, just as multiracial Americans have no legal existence today. Mixed ancestry individuals, then as now, had to be legislated out of existence. And so, for the first time, Americans faced a problem that remains unsolved and plagues the nation to this day: how to decide to which side of the color line to assign someone. In 1705, Virginia passed history's first law defining who was considered a member of the black endogamous group. The law used a 1/8 blood fraction rule. You were on the black side of the color line if you had one or more African great-grandparents. In addition, the fine for ministers performing interracial marriages was increased farther beyond reach. This law was the first instance in history of legalized hypodescent. After the turn of the 18th century, punishment of intermarriage became ever harsher. In 1705, Massachusetts outlawed interracial marriage. In 1715, Maryland and Virginia condemned women who married across the color line to 7 years of bondage, and their mixed children to 31 years of bondage. Other British colonies followed. North Carolina outlawed interracial marriage in 1715. Delaware outlawed interracial marriage in 1721. Pennsylvania outlawed interracial marriage in 1725. Dozens of interracial families, among them those who had fled from Maryland, now fled from Pennsylvania to New York, apparently seeding the maroon community known as the Jackson Whites. Fear-hatred of intermarriage spread throughout British North America until by 1776, 12 of the 13 colonies that declared their independence legally enforced endogamous color lines. Oddly, the idea of a forcibly endogamous color line did not jump the Atlantic to Europe. The New World was all the rage in Europe during the 18th century. Women's fashions ate the feathers and fringes of Native American dress. Tobacco became the most lucrative crop ever known, as smoking swept the old world. New foods like tomatoes, potatoes, corn, lima beans, were served in the best homes in Europe. The old languages absorbed new words like hurricane and tomahawk. Previously unknown creatures, like opossums, raccoons, and turkeys filled the zoos. Shakespeare's plays abound with references to the mysterious and fascinating New World. Novels and stage musicals were set in the exotic Indies. And yet, Europeans never seemed to grasp the colonial notion that Afro-European intermarriage was to be prevented. Consider Queen Charlotte. England's highest social level welcomed Afro-European intermarriage as late as 1761. King George III's wife of more than 50 years was Charlotte Sophia of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, whom he wed in that year. According to PBS frontline historian Mary of Aldezzi-Cockham, she was openly biracial, a dark noblewoman descended from Margarita de Castro y Sousa, of the Afro-European branch of the Portuguese royal house. Her biracial features are clear in contemporary portraits, the most famous being the one by Sir Alan Ramsay. 2 centuries later, according to Aldezzi-Cockham, during Queen Elizabeth II's coronation, the royal household referred to the present Queen's African bloodline, through Charlotte, in a paper it published defending her as head of the Commonwealth. The point, of course, is not whether Queen Charlotte actually had recent African ancestry. As explained in other sessions, millions of people unknowingly do. The point is that such a possibility was once welcomed, and not seen as disgraceful. Similarly, Dido Lindsay was a family member in the household of William Murray, 1st Earl of Mansfield and Speaker of the House of Lords. She was the biracial daughter of Mansfield's nephew, Rear Admiral Sir John Lindsay, and an African-born woman that the naval officer met in Cuba. Dido appears in several contemporary paintings, the most famous being one by Zoffany, the court painter to the royal family, for whom Queen Charlotte sat on a number of occasions. Incidentally, Lord Mansfield was the man who ended slavery in England when as Chief Justice of the King's Supreme Court in 1773, he ruled it unconstitutional. He ruled that the air of England is too pure for a slave to breathe, and so everyone who breathes it becomes free. Everyone who comes to this island is entitled to the protection of English law, whatever repression he may have suffered and whatever may be the color of his skin. Thenceforth, any slave would become free the instant he or she sets foot on English soil. Lord Mansfield's words are still memorized by British school children today. William Cowper, 1731–1800, made a poem out of this ruling. Slaves cannot breathe in England. If their lungs receive our air, that moment, they are free. They touch our country and their shackles fall. In the coming centuries the idea of racial African inferiority spread among Enlightenment thinkers. We can trace its spread during these years. Hobbes, 1650–1651, never used the word race in the modern sense. To Locke, 1690, our species has different stocks of equal merit. The first scholarly work identifying Africans as somehow unworthy is the first volume of Natural History by George Louis Leclerc de Buffon, 1749. Immanuel Kant, 1775, solidified what became the 19th century concept of degenerate subhuman Africans. Finally, Blumenbach, 1791, was the first European to speak of different races in the modern sense. By the way, he invented the term later used to denote white folks, based on the most beautiful skull in his collection, one from the Caucasus Mountains. But none of these later events relate to the social enforcement of a compulsorily endogamous color line. That particular innovation was unique to British North America 3 centuries ago, and remains so to this day. And, with that, I conclude today's presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Hemmings. I have one comment and one question.
Fire away.
My comment is this. I am surprised at your saying that the US intermarriage barrier was a deliberate policy imposed by colonial rulers. My experience is that people, especially minorities, naturally associate with their own kind. Catholics tend to marry Catholics, Turkish immigrants tend to marry other Turkish immigrants, and so forth.
Yes and no. The endogamy of assimilating minorities is well studied. Minority outmarriage runs from 15 to 45%. At the low end, for example, are Chinese Americans. At the high end, are Japanese Americans or Afro-British. Minorities that outmarry at even higher rates, like German Americans or Irish Americans, are hard to measure, because the very definition of minority or even of ethnicity breaks down once a group is fully assimilated by marriage. But African American outmarriage is 1/10 of those numbers. Such a low outmarriage rate resembles only that of a few religious cults. It can result only from deliberate and harshly imposed social policy in the past. These sessions explore the origin of that policy in colonial America. What was your question?
You said that, by the American Revolution, 12 of the 13 rebelling colonies had outlawed intermarriage. Which colony was the exception?
South Carolina. Incidentally, that fact was once challenged by a historian of South Carolina. She said that colonial South Carolina had many laws against interracial sex. I explained that during and after the Reformation, every Protestant land had laws against illicit sex. Fornication, unmarried sex, and adultery, extramarital sex, were outlawed virtually everywhere, and interracial sex was often vilified as somehow worse. But we are not talking here about laws against fornication and adultery. We are talking about a society who took Christianity very seriously, making the holy sacrament of matrimony a crime. South Carolina never made such a law, at least not until the Jim Crow era of state-sponsored terrorism.
Interesting. I want to ask why on earth colonial rulers felt it necessary to make marriage a crime, but I am sure you will answer that next time.
I shall.
Well, that is our time for today, ladies and gentlemen. This is Karen Sharp.
And Randolph Hemmings.
Signing off until next time.